Welcome back to Avoidant Decoded. And if you're truly ready to understand the patterns most people only feel but never see, consider becoming a member of this channel. Because today, we're not just talking about connection, we're uncovering the quiet shifts that change everything. Most people think love fades because feelings disappear. But what if it actually fades because nothing is ever at risk? Because everything is always available, always predictable, always there no matter what? What if the moment someone stops overgiving, stops chasing, and simply stands still, is the moment the entire dynamic is forced to reveal its truth? Because real connection doesn't collapse in absence, it's exposed by it. This is the moment where everything starts to shift in a way that can't be ignored. In most avoidant, anxious, or avoidant empath dynamics, what's really holding things together isn't intense love, it's predictability. The avoidant gets used to a certain emotional environment where distance doesn't lead to consequences, where pulling away doesn't result in real loss, where inconsistency gets absorbed, softened, and ultimately tolerated by the other person. So when that pattern is quietly disrupted, not through games, not through pressure, not through emotional manipulation, but through a calm withdrawal of overinvestment, it creates a completely unfamiliar experience for the avoidant. For the first time in a long time, they're in a space where access isn't automatic anymore. At the beginning, this shift can feel almost invisible. The avoidant may not even recognize it as a loss. They might assume the other person is just busy, less expressive, or simply giving space. Their internal model still expects things to return to the usual pattern. But what slowly builds isn't a single moment. It's the absence of repetition, no repeated reassurance, no emotional chasing, no long messages trying to fix or rebuild the connection, no subtle effort to pull them back in. Instead, there's a steady, grounded absence of overfunctioning. And for the first time, the avoidant is left sitting in their own emotional space without someone rushing in to fill it. This is where discomfort begins. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and unsettling. It shows up as awareness, without resolution. They can feel the gap, but nothing is stepping in to close it for them. No one is translating their distance into understanding. No one is carrying the emotional weight on their behalf. The responsibility shifts inward, and that shift matters. Avoidant individuals are often not avoiding connection itself, they're avoiding emotional pressure and the feeling of being overwhelmed. What they're not used to is a connection that doesn't collapse or chase after them when they step back. When someone stops overfunctioning, the safety net the avoidant relied on, without realizing it disappears. Now the dynamic changes. It's no longer about managing someone else's intensity. It becomes about facing their own inconsistency in a quiet, uninterrupted way. This is where real reflection can begin, not forced, not triggered by confrontation, but something that naturally emerges when the noise is gone. But it's important to understand this clearly. This shift doesn't guarantee change. It doesn't suddenly make an avoidant emotionally available. It doesn't fix their patterns overnight. What it does is remove the illusion of stability that was being maintained by the other person's effort. Now the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone who is compensating for their absence. They're facing the real impact of that absence, without filters, without cushioning, without someone constantly saying, "It's okay, I understand." Just reality, exactly as it is. At the same time, something begins to change within the empath as well. Not anger, not revenge, not calculated withdrawal, but clarity. A deeper understanding of what it feels like to stay emotionally open without receiving the same in return. A realization of how much energy was being spent trying to hold the connection together alone. A clear distinction between understanding someone and overextending for them. This is where perception shifts. Instead of reacting to isolated moments, the empath starts seeing patterns. Instead of focusing on potential, they start noticing consistency. Instead of making excuses, they begin observing behavior as it actually is. And once that awareness settles in, their emotional availability naturally adjusts. They stop offering full access by default. They stop treating distance like a problem they have to fix. They stop believing that love requires constant effort to compensate for imbalance. Their presence becomes grounded and conditional in a healthy way. If there's consistency, they move closer. If there's confusion, they step back. If there's withdrawal, they don't chase. They allow silence, not as a strategy, but as alignment. This is where the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, a loss of control over the rhythm of the relationship. Not control in a manipulative sense, but in terms of predictability. The usual cycle of pulling away, waiting, returning, and resetting starts to break, because now, no one is rushing in to restore emotional balance. Without that, the cycle can't complete itself the way it used to. At this stage, avoidants may respond in different ways. Some create more distance, testing if the connection will still come back to them. Others begin to reappear subtly, offering small signals to check if access is still open. Some move back and forth between curiosity and detachment, unsure of where they stand. But underneath all of these responses is the same thing, uncertainty that is no longer being resolved for them. And when uncertainty lingers without immediate relief, it starts to demand attention, not always action, but attention. Meanwhile, the empath is no longer operating from urgency. They're not trying to decode every shift or assign deep meaning to every behavior. They're not reacting to every return or every withdrawal. They're simply observing. And that observation isn't cold, it's grounded, because their emotional center has shifted back to themselves. This is the real turning point, not when the avoidant starts to feel something, but when the empath stops abandoning themselves just to keep the connection alive. Because at that point, the relationship is no longer being held together by imbalance. It can only exist through mutual presence. And if that presence isn't consistent, the connection can't stabilize on hope alone anymore. What's left is truth, clear and undistorted. From that place, one of two outcomes eventually unfolds. Either the avoidant begins to adjust, slowly realizing that connection now requires consistency and presence, or they step away entirely, unable to stay where access is no longer guaranteed. But in both cases, something has already changed for the empath. They're no longer waiting inside uncertainty. They're no longer structuring their emotional life around someone else's unpredictability. They're no longer trying to fix distance by abandoning themselves. They're grounded, not disconnected from emotion, but free from overfunctioning. And that distinction is what ends the imbalance. Because when one person stops overgiving to stabilize inconsistency, that inconsistency has to stand on its own. What keeps avoidant patterns comfortable isn't love, it's certainty. The quiet assumption that someone will always be there, always understanding, always filling in the emotional gaps, that no matter how inconsistent things become, access will never truly be at risk. But the moment that certainty fades, something begins to shift. Complacency turns into curiosity. And in avoidant psychology, curiosity is far more powerful than constant availability. Because avoidance isn't drawn to what feels overwhelming. It moves toward what feels lighter, less consuming, something slightly out of reach, slightly undefined, not fully claimed. The mind becomes engaged when the emotional system is no longer saturated. When something is always there, it fades into the background. But when it's no longer guaranteed, the mind starts to reassess its value. And that's where the real shift begins. This process doesn't always happen in a conscious way. It shows up more subtly, through attention, through comparison, through a quiet noticing of what's there and what's no longer there. And this is where a lot of people misunderstand what's actually going on. There's a common belief that the more love you give, the more secure the connection becomes. That if you try harder, show more, explain more, and stay emotionally open, the relationship will naturally deepen. But in avoidant dynamics, it doesn't always work like that. Too much constant emotional availability can actually remove the tension that keeps the connection mentally engaging. When everything is fully known, fully given, and always accessible, there's nothing left to question, nothing left to pursue, nothing that creates that sense of curiosity. And without that subtle tension, interest can slowly fade into distance. Not because the connection didn't matter, not because the person wasn't valued, but because the emotional system is no longer being activated by contrast. When everything becomes predictable, it stops being examined, it gets taken for granted. But when an empath, someone who used to overgive, over-explain, and stay present even when distance was needed, begins to shift into being more selective, everything starts to change. Not in a dramatic way, not through coldness or playing games, just through a quiet decision about where their energy goes and where it no longer goes. The avoidant begins to notice that access isn't automatic anymore. Something that once came freely now requires consistency, presence, and effort. And this introduces something unfamiliar to them, the awareness of limits. Scarcity doesn't just reduce access, it changes how something is perceived. It makes what was once overlooked suddenly feel important again. Not because it wasn't always valuable, but because it's no longer constantly available in the background. And this is where it can look confusing from the outside, because it's not manipulation, it's not someone pulling away to trigger a reaction, it's not a strategy to make the other person chase, it's self-correction. The empath is no longer overfunctioning in a dynamic that doesn't meet them emotionally. Their empathy is still there, their depth hasn't disappeared, but they're no longer abandoning themselves to keep the connection alive. And that difference is something the avoidant can feel, even if they can't fully explain it. There's a clear distinction between someone stepping back to provoke closeness and someone stepping back because they're no longer available for imbalance. The first creates tension that can be temporarily resolved with reassurance or attention. The second creates a completely different reality, one where inconsistency no longer works. Because now, access isn't assumed. It's something that has to be observed through behavior. And anything that has to be observed starts to carry more weight. The way the empath communicates also changes. There's no emotional chaos, no repeated confrontations, no long explanations trying to force clarity out of confusion. Instead, there's calm, direct communication, said once clearly, without emotional escalation. After that, attention shifts away from words and toward actions, because they begin to understand something important. Affection without consistency doesn't create safety, it creates dependence on unpredictability. And unpredictability, over time, becomes exhausting, so they stop relying on promises. They stop rebuilding trust based on words alone. They stop resetting the cycle every time reassurance is offered, without real follow-through. They stop treating potential like it's the same as presence. And they stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional reliability. Instead, they observe, quietly, consistently. They stop investing emotionally in what could happen, and they start paying attention to what actually does happen. And when behavior doesn't match what was said, they adjust, not to punish, not to send a message, but to stay aligned with reality. There's no big announcement, no dramatic ending, no attempt to force understanding, just a gradual release of emotional dependence on inconsistency. And that's when the avoidant feels the real shift. Not through conflict, not through emotional breakdown, but through a change in access, through the space between presence and absence becoming more defined, through the realization that connection is no longer running on autopilot. It now responds directly to behavior. That alone changes everything. What once felt endlessly available now has structure. What once felt flexible now has boundaries. What once required no awareness now demands it. The avoidant is no longer operating in familiar conditions. There's no longer unlimited access without effort, no longer easy returns without consequence, no longer the quiet assumption that the connection will absorb inconsistency without changing. And within that change, something important happens. The connection becomes real, not necessarily easier, not necessarily more comfortable, but more grounded in what is actually happening rather than what is hoped for. From here, things move in one of two directions. Either the avoidant begins to lean in, becoming more attentive, more responsive, more present, or they pull back further, unable to adapt to a dynamic where access is no longer guaranteed. And when they do start leaning in, it's not always because of a sudden emotional breakthrough. It's because something in the system has shifted. They're no longer receiving the same effortless emotional access they once relied on. They begin to feel the absence of what was quietly holding everything together before. The consistent effort, the patience, the emotional understanding that used to absorb inconsistency without asking for much in return. All the emotional labor that once came freely is no longer automatic. And that absence is what brings everything into focus. When someone has been used to having emotional space without any real consequences, they often assume that space will always be there. But when that steady availability starts to fade, it creates a kind of internal emptiness. That emptiness is what pulls their attention back in. What's often misunderstood in this moment is the idea that this shift automatically means the avoidant person is growing emotionally. That's not necessarily true. What's really happening is more of an adjustment. Their system is reacting to a change in the emotional dynamic, not suddenly gaining deep awareness or insight. The real change isn't happening on their side anyway, it's happening within the empath. The empath is no longer tied to whether the other person reaches out or not. Their emotional stability isn't hanging on the next message or moment of connection. Their sense of self-worth isn't waiting to be validated through someone else's inconsistency. They've stepped out of the role they used to play. They're no longer managing the emotional weight of the relationship, smoothing things over, overthinking silence, or filling in the gaps that were never clearly addressed. They're no longer trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. And once that role is gone, the entire dynamic has to shift. Not because anyone is forcing it, but because a relationship built on imbalance can't stay the same when one person stops overcompensating. This is where avoidant patterns really start to get disrupted. Not through punishment or dramatic behavior, but through something much quieter, the removal of constant unconditional emotional access. That automatic closeness is no longer there. That warmth isn't just always available regardless of behavior. And for the avoidant, this introduces something unfamiliar. Not pressure, not chaos, but consequence. A situation where distance actually means something, where absence isn't quietly absorbed anymore, where actions start to affect the level of connection. At first, this can lead to increased effort, more messages, more check-ins, more visible attention. But that doesn't necessarily mean emotional depth has suddenly developed. It's often just a reaction to the change, an attempt to restore what used to feel familiar. Whether that effort turns into something real depends on consistency over time. Intensity can come and go. Awareness can show up briefly. Even moments of emotional clarity can happen when things feel uncertain. But consistency is what actually determines whether anything has truly changed. Meanwhile, the empath is in a completely different place. They're no longer trying to stabilize themselves through someone else's behavior. They're not overanalyzing inconsistency or mistaking unpredictability for depth. They're not trying harder just to make things feel balanced. They can care without chasing. They can feel without losing themselves. They can stay connected without abandoning their own needs. And that shift changes everything, because now their presence comes from choice, not obligation. Connection is no longer maintained through overextending. It's built through mutual effort. At that point, the relationship either evolves or falls apart. Not because someone gains control, but because the imbalance that held it together is no longer there. What becomes clear is simple. Access isn't automatic anymore. It's something that comes from consistent behavior. It's maintained through effort, and it weakens when inconsistency continues. Avoidant patterns often last as long as they do because the environment around them supports it. Someone is always adjusting, always making sense of things, always filling in the emotional gaps. Because of that, distance never really carries weight. It's absorbed, excused, or softened. That's why things can go on like this for so long without real change. But everything shifts when one person stops abandoning themselves, not through games or manipulation, but through a grounded decision to stop carrying both sides of the relationship. Once that happens, the imbalance becomes obvious. The gaps are no longer covered. Silence isn't turned into reassurance. Effort isn't one-sided anymore. There's just space where overcompensation used to be, and that space changes everything. For the avoidant, it can feel confusing. The usual patterns don't get the same response. Distance doesn't guarantee connection anymore. Withdrawal doesn't come with unlimited emotional safety. And that's often when their attention comes back, not just because of fear, but because the system itself has changed. The emotional availability that was once constant is now tied to reciprocity. But again, the deeper transformation isn't happening on their side. It's happening within the empath. The real turning point is when you no longer need someone else's effort to feel stable or whole, when your emotional state isn't dependent on their behavior, when your presence in a relationship isn't built on sacrificing yourself and calling it love. At that stage, love doesn't disappear, it matures, it becomes more grounded, more self-aware. It stops confusing endurance with depth. It stops seeing inconsistency as something meaningful. It stops accepting imbalance as something that just needs more patience. Instead, it recognizes that real connection can't exist when one person is always giving more and the other is always pulling away without accountability. So the empath starts to show up differently, not closed off or cold, but no longer available in a way that erases themselves. They stay open, but with boundaries, loving, but not at their own expense, present, but not consumed. And that shift creates a new reality that can't be ignored, because now connection depends on alignment, consistency, and shared effort. At that point, something very clear stands out. You can't build emotional safety on one person constantly adjusting, and you can't sustain a meaningful connection if only one person is holding it together. So the outcome isn't about whether the avoidant changes or whether the empath awakens them. It's much simpler than that. When self-abandonment ends, the dynamic can't continue the same way. What's left is the truth of whether two people can actually meet each other with consistency, presence, and mutual responsibility. Everything else was just noise around that. Nothing truly changed because someone tried harder. It changed because someone finally stopped abandoning themselves. The connection was no longer sustained by overgiving, but tested by consistency. What remained was no longer illusion, but truth revealed through behavior, and in that truth, the dynamic either evolved into something real or quietly dissolved into what it always was, because real connection doesn't survive on effort alone, it survives on mutual presence.